In the sweltering Louisiana parish of St. Landry, there's a cemetery that locals refuse to enter after dark. 12 identical headstones stand in a perfect circle beneath a centuries-old cypress tree, marking the graves of plantation owners who all died within 18 months of each other between 1847 and 1849. The official records list their deaths as yellow fever, cholera, and natural causes. But in 1967, when Hurricane Audrey uprooted that ancient cypress, construction workers discovered something that made the coroner seal the site immediately. 12 glass vials buried in a lead box, each labeled with a name, a date, and a single word written in flawless French: vengeance. What authorities found inside those vials would remain classified for decades, but the story of who put them there and why 12 of Louisiana's wealthiest men died screaming in their sleep has been whispered about in Creole communities for over 170 years. This is the true story of Matthieu Devereaux, the slave who became Louisiana's most successful serial killer, and the methodical campaign of poison that authorities never solved. Before we descend into this nightmare from America's darkest era, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, the ones they tried to erase from history, are what we specialize in. Ring that notification bell and drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from. Your engagement keeps these buried stories alive. Now, let me take you back to Louisiana in 1846, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from every tree, and the air itself felt thick enough to drown in. The Devereaux plantation sat on 3,000 acres of prime Louisiana Delta land, where sugarcane grew so tall it could hide a man on horseback. The main house, a Greek Revival mansion with 22 rooms and galleries that wrapped around all four sides, stood like a white monument to wealth built on human suffering. Inside that house lived Jean-Baptiste Devereaux, his wife Celestine, their 4 children, and their personal house slaves who catered to their every whim. 300 yards behind that beautiful house, in the slave quarters that the family never visited, lived 147 enslaved people whose labor generated the Devereaux fortune. Among them was a man named Matthieu, though that wasn't the name he'd been born with. His mother had called him Kofi, a name from her Ashanti homeland. But when he was sold at age 7, his new owners renamed him Matthieu, later Frenchified to Matthieu, when the plantation changed hands. By 1846, Matthieu was 42 years old, which made him ancient by slave standards. Most field workers didn't survive past their 30s, worn down by brutal labor, inadequate food, and the casual violence that characterized plantation life. But Matthieu had survived because he possessed a skill that made him too valuable to work to death in the cane fields. He could read and write in 3 languages, calculate complex mathematical equations in his head, and most importantly, he understood chemistry with an intuition that even educated white men found remarkable. His previous owner, a French Creole doctor named Armand Thibodeau, had recognized Matthieu's intelligence and used him as an assistant in his medical practice. For 15 years, Matthieu had helped Dr. Thibodeau prepare medicines, assist with surgeries, and study the properties of the herbs and plants that grew wild in Louisiana's swamps and forests. The doctor had even allowed Matthieu access to his extensive medical library, where the slave had absorbed knowledge of pharmacology, toxicology, and human anatomy that few physicians of the era possessed. When Dr. Thibodeau died in 1845, His estate was liquidated to pay gambling debts, and Matthieu found himself sold to Jean-Baptiste Devereaux for the princely sum of $2,000. The price reflected Matthieu's education and skills, but it also marked the beginning of a nightmare that would transform a healer into a killer. Jean-Baptiste Devereaux was not like the refined Dr. Thibodeau. Where Thibodeau had been cultured and relatively humane by the standards of his time, Devereaux was brutal, paranoid, and sadistic. He believed that enslaved people were naturally lazy and required constant punishment to maintain productivity. His overseers carried whips that they used freely, and the plantation's punishment stocks were rarely empty. Matthieu was initially spared the worst of the plantation's brutality because Devereaux quickly recognized the value of having an educated slave who could read correspondence, keep accurate records, and prepare medicines for the family. For the first 6 months of his ownership, Matthieu lived in relative safety, working in the plantation office during the day and returning to his small cabin in the quarters each evening. That's where he met Josephine. She was 28 years old, with intelligent eyes that had somehow retained their warmth despite 28 years of slavery. Josephine worked as a seamstress, creating and repairing the fine clothes that the Devereaux family wore to balls and social gatherings. Her skill with needle and thread was legendary among Louisiana's planter class, and Celestine Devereaux often loaned her out to other wealthy families for special projects, earning additional income from Josephine's talent. Matthieu and Josephine's courtship was conducted in stolen moments, brief conversations after dark, shared meals when the overseers weren't watching, whispered dreams of a freedom they knew would never come. Within 3 months, they had formed the kind of bond that slavery was specifically designed to prevent, a connection strong enough to give them hope in a hopeless situation. They were married in a ceremony that had no legal recognition, but carried all the spiritual weight of any sacred union. An elderly slave named Abraham, who had been a tribal elder in Africa before his capture, performed the ritual using traditions passed down through generations of enslaved people who refused to let their humanity be stripped away by bondage. Josephine became pregnant in early 1846, and for a brief time, Matthieu allowed himself to imagine a future. Even if his child would be born into slavery, at least they would exist, and Matthieu promised himself he would find a way to teach his son or daughter everything he knew, passing on the knowledge that made survival possible. But Jean-Baptiste Devereaux had other plans. In May of 1846, Devereaux's eldest son, Claude, turned 18 and was given authority over the plantation's daily operations as preparation for eventually inheriting the property. Claude had inherited his father's cruelty, but lacked even the basic intelligence needed to run a complex agricultural operation. His idea of management consisted of randomly punishing slaves to establish dominance and making impulsive decisions that disrupted the careful rhythms of plantation work. Claude took particular interest in Josephine, whose beauty had not gone unnoticed among the plantation's white men. In Louisiana's slave society, enslaved women had no protection from sexual assault by their owners, and the children born from such violence were considered property of the mother's owner, adding to their human inventory. Matthieu knew what was coming before it happened. He saw the way Claude looked at Josephine, the way the young master found excuses to visit the sewing room where she worked, the way his comments became increasingly crude and explicit. When Matthieu tried to appeal to Jean-Baptiste Devereaux for protection, the master's response was brutally simple. "Your wife is my property, and my son can do with my property as he pleases. If you interfere, I'll sell you to a sugar mill, where you'll be worked to death within a year." Matthieu had no choice but to watch as Claude began regularly visiting Josephine, using his position of absolute power to do whatever he wanted. The psychological torture of knowing what was happening to his wife, being powerless to stop it, and seeing the light slowly die in Josephine's eyes, transformed something fundamental in Matthieu's soul. The man who had dedicated his life to healing began to contemplate murder. In July of 1846, Josephine miscarried. The trauma of Claude's assaults combined with her existing pregnancy resulted in complications that nearly killed her. Matthieu used every bit of medical knowledge he possessed to save her life, sitting up for 3 days straight as she fought through fever and blood loss. She survived, but something between them had been broken. They still loved each other, but that love was now wrapped in shared trauma that neither could escape. As Matthieu sat beside Josephine's bed during her recovery, watching her sleep fitfully, he made a decision that would eventually result in 12 deaths. He would kill Claude Devereaux and anyone else who had participated in or enabled what happened to his wife, but he wouldn't do it in a way that would result in immediate retribution against other slaves, or that would allow his targets to die quickly. They would suffer, as he and Josephine had suffered, and he would be methodical enough that authorities would never connect the deaths to him. The problem was execution. Matthieu couldn't simply poison Claude without arousing immediate suspicion. As the only person on the plantation with pharmaceutical knowledge, he would be the obvious suspect. He needed to establish a pattern that would deflect suspicion, create multiple victims whose deaths appeared natural, and ensure that even if authorities eventually suspected poisoning, they would never be able to prove it or identify the poisoner. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its patience. He would spend months, possibly years, systematically eliminating not just Claude, but all the wealthy plantation owners in St. Landry Parish who participated in and profited from the system that had destroyed his family. He would make their deaths appear natural by using toxins that mimicked common diseases, and he would vary his methods enough that no pattern emerged until it was too late to stop him. Matthieu's education under Dr. Thibodeau had given him extensive knowledge of Louisiana's native plants, many of which contained powerful toxins. The swamps and forests surrounding the plantation were essentially a pharmacy of deadly substances if you knew where to look and how to process them. Water hemlock, oleander, pokeweed, nightshade. These plants and dozens of others could be processed into poisons that mimicked everything from heart attacks to cholera. But Matthieu's true innovation was his understanding of what we now call toxicology, the science of how poisons affect the human body. He knew that different toxins produced different symptoms, that proper dosing could control the speed of death, and that certain compounds were virtually undetectable by the medical knowledge of the 1840s. His most important discovery came from his study of a plant called white snake root, which grew abundantly in the forests of Louisiana. White snake root contained a toxin called tremetol that was odorless, tasteless, and caused a condition that physicians of the era called milk sickness. The symptoms included tremors, vomiting, severe abdominal pain, and eventual death from metabolic acidosis. Crucially, milk sickness was considered a natural illness caused by contaminated milk or water, and doctors of the 1840s had no way to identify tremetol poisoning. Matthieu spent the late summer and fall of 1846 carefully gathering and processing white snake root, extracting the trematol through a method he had learned from his study of Dr. Thibodeau's chemistry texts. The process was dangerous. A single mistake could expose him to lethal doses, but his careful nature and precise understanding of chemistry allowed him to eventually produce a small vial of concentrated poison. Now, he needed access to his victims. Claude Devereaux would be his first target, but Matthieu couldn't poison him directly. Instead, he needed to create an opportunity that would deflect suspicion while ensuring Claude's death. The solution came from an unexpected source: Jean-Baptiste Devereaux's pride in his son. In November of 1846, Jean-Baptiste hosted a dinner party to introduce Claude to Louisiana's planter elite, essentially announcing that his son was ready to join the exclusive club of wealthy landowners who controlled the region's economy and politics. 12 plantation owners and their wives were invited to the Devereaux mansion for an elaborate meal that would showcase the family's wealth and social status. The preparation for this dinner party consumed the plantation for weeks. The house had to be cleaned until it sparkled. The gardens had to be perfected. And most importantly, the food had to be exceptional. Célestine Devereaux insisted on serving traditional French cuisine, prepared by the plantation's cook, an enslaved woman named Esther, who had learned her skills from a New Orleans chef. Matthieu's opportunity came through Esther's medical needs. The cook suffered from chronic pain in her hands, arthritis that made cooking increasingly difficult. She had been asking Jean-Baptiste for medicine, and he had finally ordered Matthieu to prepare something that would allow Esther to complete the dinner preparations without complaint. Matthieu prepared a perfectly legitimate pain remedy made from willow bark extract, which actually did help Esther's arthritis. But he also spent hours talking with her about the dinner party, learning every detail of the menu, the schedule, and most importantly, how the food would be served. What he learned was that the dinner would include a traditional French dish called blanquette de veau, a veal stew served in a white cream sauce. The sauce, Esther explained, required careful preparation and would be made the day before the party, then gently reheated before serving. This cream sauce would be Matthieu's delivery method. On the day before the dinner party, Matthieu volunteered to help Esther with her preparations, citing his desire to learn French cooking. His real purpose was to add concentrated trematol to the cream sauce in amounts calculated to ensure a delayed but fatal reaction. The poison would be tasteless and odorless, and by the time symptoms appeared, the victims would be back at their own plantations, making it impossible to identify the source of their illness. But Matthieu made a crucial decision that would define his entire campaign. He didn't poison the entire batch of sauce. Instead, he prepared 12 individual portions, each one calculated for a specific victim based on their weight and general health. The portions for younger, healthier men contained more toxin, while older or frailer individuals received smaller doses. This wasn't mercy, it was calculation. By varying the doses, Matthieu ensured that the victims would die at different times over the following weeks and months, making it less likely that anyone would connect their deaths to a single source. The dinner party on November 15, 1846, was everything Jean-Baptiste Devereaux had hoped for. Louisiana's wealthiest planters gathered in the mansion's grand dining room, drinking expensive wine and discussing the excellent cotton and sugar prices that were making them all richer. Their wives, dressed in the latest fashions from Paris, gossiped about social events and showed off jewelry purchased with money earned from human bondage. Claude Devereaux sat at his father's right hand, accepting congratulations and advice from men who saw him as the next generation of Louisiana's planter aristocracy. Matthieu served the meal alongside other house slaves, moving invisibly among the guests as he carried plates and refilled glasses. When the Blanquette de veau was served, he watched carefully as each guest consumed their portion of the poisoned cream sauce. Some ate heartily, praising Esther's preparation. Others picked at their food, more interested in conversation and wine. But all of them consumed enough poison to ensure their eventual death. The first victim died 3 days later. Pierre Rousseau, a 60-year-old cotton planter from the northern part of St. Landry Parish, fell ill on November 18th with symptoms that his physician diagnosed as cholera. Rousseau experienced violent vomiting, severe abdominal pain, and tremors that shook his entire body. He died on November 20th, and his death was attributed to the cholera outbreaks that periodically swept through Louisiana's humid climate. No one connected his death to the dinner party 3 days earlier. The second death came a week later. Marcel Thibault, a 45-year-old sugar planter and one of the wealthiest men in the parish, developed similar symptoms, but lingered longer due to his otherwise robust health. His suffering lasted 5 days before he finally died on November 27th. Again, physicians attributed his death to disease, specifically citing bad water as the likely cause. By mid-December, 4 more dinner guests had died, and Louisiana's medical community was growing concerned about what appeared to be an outbreak of some unknown illness. But because the deaths were spread across different parts of the parish and occurred at different intervals, no one yet suspected poisoning or connected the fatalities to the Devereaux dinner party. Matthieu watched these developments with cold satisfaction. His plan was working perfectly. The poison was killing his targets while appearing to be natural illness, and the varied timing of the deaths prevented anyone from identifying a pattern. But he knew that eventually someone would make the connection, which meant he needed to work quickly to complete his mission before suspicion fell on the dinner party. Claude Devereaux fell ill on December 20th, 1846. His symptoms were particularly severe, possibly because Matthieu had given him one of the higher doses of poison. The young man's suffering lasted 8 days, during which he experienced hallucinations, uncontrollable tremors, and pain so intense that his screams could be heard throughout the plantation. Jean-Baptiste Devereaux summoned every physician within 50 miles, but none could identify the illness or provide effective treatment. Claude died on December 28th, and his father's grief transformed into rage. Someone, Jean-Baptiste insisted, had poisoned his son. The dinner party was the only possible source, and he demanded that authorities investigate every person who had been present that night. The investigation that followed was complicated by the fact that 12 people who had attended the dinner were now dead, while the 12 who survived included all the wives who had eaten different portions or less of the meal. Authorities questioned every slave who had helped with the preparation and serving, but Matthieu's careful planning had left no evidence connecting him to the poisoning. The cream sauce had been consumed completely, leaving no samples to test. Esther's preparation methods were examined and found to be perfectly normal. The ingredients had come from reputable suppliers and showed no signs of contamination. As the investigation stalled, Louisiana's planter community grew increasingly paranoid. If the dinner party deaths were indeed poisoning, it meant that someone had successfully killed 12 of the region's wealthiest and most powerful men. The implications were terrifying. If one educated slave could orchestrate such an attack, what did that say about the stability of the entire slave system? The paranoia intensified in January of 1847, when 2 more dinner guests died, bringing the total to 8. Authorities now had to accept that the deaths were connected to the Devereaux party, but they still couldn't identify the poison used or determine how it had been administered. The investigation expanded to include examination of the plantation's water supply, testing of stored food items, and interrogation of slaves from neighboring properties. But Matthieu had been too careful. He had left no physical evidence, no witnesses who could testify to seeing him add anything to the food, and no motive that authorities would consider sufficient for such an elaborate plot. After all, everyone knew that Claude had been assaulting Josephine, but that was considered normal and acceptable behavior by the legal standards of the time. A slave seeking revenge for his wife's rape would never have been considered a plausible theory by white investigators who didn't view enslaved people as fully human. By March of 1847, the investigation had essentially ended without resolution. 10 of the 12 dinner guests were dead, and the 2 survivors had fled Louisiana entirely, terrified that they might be next. Jean-Baptiste Devereaux, consumed by grief over his son's death and paranoia about who might have killed him, began drinking heavily and retreating from social interactions. The plantation's management fell into chaos as he neglected his responsibilities and became increasingly erratic. But Matthieu wasn't finished. The dinner party poisoning had been successful, but it had only eliminated men who had attended a single event. There were dozens of other plantation owners in the region who participated in the same system, who bought and sold human beings, who raped enslaved women and brutalized enslaved men. Matthieu decided that he would continue his campaign, targeting new victims using different methods to avoid establishing any pattern that might lead investigators back to him. His next target was Armand Bouchard, a plantation owner who lived 15 miles south of the Devereaux property. Bouchard was notorious for his treatment of slaves, particularly his use of dogs trained to track and attack runaways. Matthieu had never met Bouchard personally, but he knew the man's reputation and considered him a worthy target for elimination. The challenge was access. Matthieu couldn't easily travel to Bouchard's plantation without arousing suspicion, and he couldn't use the same poisoning method he had employed at the dinner party. He needed a new approach that would allow him to kill from a distance while making the death appear natural or accidental. The solution came from Matthieu's knowledge of Louisiana's ecology. The region was home to several species of venomous snakes, including the cottonmouth water moccasin, whose bite could be fatal if not treated immediately. Snake bites were common enough that a death from venomous snake wouldn't arouse suspicion, especially if the victim was known to spend time near swamps or waterways where snakes were abundant. Matthieu spent weeks studying the behavior and venom of cottonmouth snakes, catching specimens in the swamps surrounding the plantation and carefully observing their hunting patterns and striking behavior. He learned that the snakes were most active at dawn and dusk, that they were attracted to warm bodies and movement, and that they would strike defensively if they felt threatened. His plan was both simple and diabolical. He would capture several cottonmouth snakes, transport them to Bouchard's plantation, and release them in locations where the man was likely to encounter them under conditions that would result in a fatal bite. The execution would require perfect timing and detailed knowledge of Bouchard's routines, but Matthieu was patient and methodical. He spent months gathering intelligence about Bouchard through the informal network of communication that existed among slaves on different plantations. House slaves who occasionally traveled between properties shared information about their masters' schedules, habits, and movements. Through these sources, Matthieu learned that Bouchard had a morning routine that included checking on his prize horses in a barn located near the edge of a swampy area. The barn visit occurred before dawn, when visibility was poor and when cottonmouth snakes were most active. In June of 1847, Matthieu obtained permission to travel to a neighboring plantation to treat a slave who was seriously ill, a journey that would take him within 2 miles of Bouchard's property. He used this opportunity to scout the location, identifying the barn that Bouchard visited each morning and locating the best spots to release snakes that would likely remain in the area until they encountered the plantation owner. The actual implementation occurred 3 weeks later, when Matthieu again obtained permission to make a medical visit to a different plantation. This time, he carried with him a sealed leather bag containing 4 cottonmouth snakes he had captured and kept alive by feeding them mice. The snakes were agitated from their confinement, which would make them more aggressive when released. Under cover of darkness, Matthieu approached Bouchard's barn and released the 4 snakes in strategic locations where they would be likely to encounter someone entering the building. He placed one near the door that Bouchard used, another near the feed bins, where the man would reach without looking carefully, and the remaining 2 in corners, where they might be accidentally disturbed. Armand Bouchard died on July 3, 1847, after being bitten multiple times by cottonmouth snakes he encountered when entering his barn at dawn. The plantation slaves found him an hour later, already dead from the massive amount of venom in his system. His death was ruled accidental, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in Louisiana's dangerous environment. No one suspected that the snakes had been deliberately placed, and Matthieu was 60 miles away with perfect alibis when the death occurred. This success emboldened Matthieu to expand his campaign. Over the following months, he developed new methods for killing plantation owners, while making their deaths appear natural or accidental. Each murder required weeks or months of preparation, careful study of the victim's routines, and patience to wait for the perfect opportunity. In September of 1847, he poisoned well water at a plantation owned by Etienne Marchand, using a slow-acting toxin derived from oleander plants that caused symptoms resembling typhoid fever. Marchand died after 2 weeks of suffering, and 3 other people on his plantation, including 2 overseers, also died from drinking the contaminated water. The deaths were attributed to disease, and the well was closed as a public health measure. In November of 1847, Matthieu caused a fire at the plantation of Georges Duval by sabotaging an oil lamp in the man's bedroom. Duval died from smoke inhalation before he could escape, and the fire destroyed a significant portion of his mansion. Investigators concluded that the lamp had been knocked over accidentally, possibly by Duval himself in his sleep. In January of 1848, Matthieu arranged a riding accident for Charles Lavigne, a particularly brutal overseer who had been promoted to plantation manager after his owner's death. Using his knowledge of horse behavior and chemistry, Matthieu created a paste from crushed insects that caused intense irritation and applied it to the saddle blanket of Lavigne's horse. When the blanket was placed on the horse's back, the irritation caused the animal to buck violently, throwing Lavigne and breaking his neck. The death was ruled accidental. By the spring of 1848, Louisiana's planter community was experiencing what they could only describe as an epidemic of bad luck. over a dozen prominent plantation owners had died in 18 months from causes that included disease, accidents, snake bites, and fire. Some people began whispering about curses or divine judgment, while others insisted that the deaths were simply the kind of tragic coincidences that occasionally occurred in a dangerous environment. But a few observers, including a newspaper editor named Samuel Pritchard, began documenting the deaths and noticing patterns that suggested something more sinister. Pritchard published an article in June of 1848 titled The Plague of St. Landry, which listed all the recent deaths of plantation owners and raised questions about whether the fatalities could all be coincidental. His article noted that the death rate among wealthy landowners had increased by over 500% compared to previous years, and that many of the deaths involved unusual circumstances or unexplained illnesses. The article created a sensation throughout Louisiana, but it didn't provide any answers about who might be responsible or how such a campaign could be orchestrated. Authorities reopened investigations into several of the deaths, but they found no evidence of deliberate murder in any individual case. Each death, when examined separately, appeared to be natural or accidental. It was only when viewed collectively that the pattern became suspicious. Matthieu knew that increased scrutiny made his continued operation more dangerous, but he also knew that authorities were looking in the wrong direction. Investigators were focused on possible business rivals, disputes between wealthy families, or organized criminal activity. The idea that a single slave could be responsible for such an extensive campaign of murder was so far outside their worldview that they literally couldn't conceive of it as a possibility. Throughout 1848 and into early 1849, Matthieu continued his work, adding 4 more victims to his count through methods that included food poisoning, drowning that appeared accidental, exposure to toxic plants disguised as decoration, and a carefully engineered collapse of an unstable structure. Each murder required extensive planning and perfect execution, but Matthieu's methodical nature and comprehensive understanding of chemistry, medicine, and human behavior made him nearly impossible to catch. By March of 1849, 18 months after Pritchard's article had appeared, 12 plantation owners were dead beyond the original dinner party victims, bringing Matthieu's total to 22 kills. But the increasing attention from authorities and the growing paranoia among Louisiana's planter community made continued operations increasingly risky. Jean-Baptiste Devereaux had descended into alcoholism and madness, ranting about curses and conspiracy theories while the plantation fell into disrepair. Several wealthy families had left Louisiana entirely, selling their properties and relocating to other states where they felt safer. The region's economy was suffering as investment dried up, and buyers became reluctant to purchase plantations that seemed to be death traps for their owners. In April of 1849, authorities made their first real breakthrough in the investigation. A chemistry professor from New Orleans, brought in to examine evidence from several of the deaths, identified traces of trematol in tissue samples preserved from some of the dinner party victims. This discovery proved that the deaths had been caused by deliberate poisoning rather than natural illness, which transformed the investigation from a search for explanations into a manhunt for a murderer. The identification of trematol as the poison used at the dinner party should have led investigators directly to Matthieu. He was the only person at the Devereaux plantation with the knowledge necessary to extract and concentrate the toxin, and he had been present when the fatal meal was prepared. But the investigation was hampered by the investigators' own prejudices and assumptions. The complexity of the poisoning scheme, the sophisticated knowledge of chemistry required, and the methodical planning involved seemed impossible to attribute to a slave. Authorities began searching for an educated white man with medical training who might have infiltrated the plantation or bribed someone to add poison to the food. Matthieu watched these investigations with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Even when presented with evidence that should have led directly to him, authorities refused to consider that a slave could have orchestrated such an elaborate campaign of murder. Their blindness gave him protection, but it also highlighted the fundamental lack of respect that defined how enslaved people were viewed by white society. In May of 1849, Matthieu made a decision that would ensure his story became legend rather than simply being forgotten. He decided to stop killing and instead to disappear, leaving behind evidence that would eventually reveal his identity and methods, but only after he was safely beyond the reach of authorities. His first step was creating a record of his campaign. Using paper stolen from the plantation office and ink he made himself, Matthieu wrote a detailed journal documenting each of his murders. The journal included victim names, methods used, dates of death, and most importantly, his motivations. He wrote about watching Josephine being raped by Claude Devereaux, about the casual cruelty of a system that treated human beings as property, and about his decision to use his education and skills to destroy as many participants in that system as possible. The journal was written in French, Latin, and English, demonstrating Matthieu's education while making it accessible to future readers. He included detailed chemical formulas for the poisons he had used, descriptions of plants and their toxic properties, and explanations of how he had concealed his crimes by making deaths appear natural. The document was essentially a confession, but it was also a testament to the intelligence and capability that white society insisted didn't exist in enslaved people. Matthieu's second step was preparing his escape. He had been saving small amounts of money for years, coins obtained through various means and hidden in a waterproof container buried near his cabin. He also had detailed knowledge of Louisiana's geography from his years of medical travel between plantations, and he knew the routes that runaways used to reach the relative safety of Mexico or the northern states. But he faced a significant obstacle. Josephine was in no condition to travel. The physical and psychological trauma she had endured had left her weak and often ill, and Matthieu knew that attempting a dangerous journey through swamps and forests would likely kill her. He faced an impossible choice: escape alone and survive, or stay with Josephine, and eventually be caught and executed. Josephine made the decision for him. In June of 1849, during one of their whispered conversations after dark, she told him that he had to leave without her. The work he had done, killing the men who profited from slavery, was too important to end with his capture. She would remain behind, and if authorities eventually discovered the truth, she would claim ignorance of his activities. "You've given me revenge," Josephine told him, her voice weak but certain. "Claude died screaming, and so did the others. That's more than most of us ever get. Now you need to survive and make sure people know what happened here. Make sure they understand that even slaves can fight back." Matthieu's escape occurred on June 23, 1849. He left the plantation during the confusion of a thunderstorm that made visibility nearly impossible and covered any sounds of his movement. He carried minimal supplies, a knife, a small amount of money, dried food, and his journal sealed in a waterproof leather case. Before leaving, He buried 12 glass vials beneath the cypress tree in the cemetery, where his victims were buried. Each vial contained a small amount of the poison he had used, along with a label bearing the victim's name and the single word, vengeance. This deliberate leaving of evidence was Matthieu's signature, proof that the deaths had been murder rather than coincidence, and a message that would eventually tell his story even if he was never caught. Matthieu's journey to freedom took him through some of Louisiana's most dangerous terrain. He traveled mostly at night, using his knowledge of plants to find food and medicine along the way. He avoided main roads and populated areas, sticking to swamps and forests where pursuit would be difficult. Several times he came close to being caught, once by slave patrollers who passed within yards of where he was hiding in thick vegetation. After 3 weeks of travel, Matthieu crossed into Texas, which was then an independent republic with looser enforcement of slave laws. From Texas, he made his way to Mexico, where slavery had been abolished in 1829, and where he could live as a free man without fear of being forcibly returned to Louisiana. The discovery that Matthieu had escaped created panic at the Devereaux Plantation and throughout St. Landry Parish. Jean-Baptiste Devereaux offered a substantial reward for Matthieu's capture, and slave hunters searched Louisiana's swamps and forests for months without finding any trace of him. But the more significant discovery came in September of 1849, when a groundskeeper at the parish cemetery noticed fresh digging beneath the ancient cypress tree. Curious about possible grave robbing, he excavated the area and found the lead box containing 12 glass vials. Parish authorities initially kept the discovery quiet while they investigated what the vials contained. Chemical analysis revealed that each vial held concentrated trematol, the same poison that had killed the dinner party victims. The labels on the vials matched the names of men who had died under suspicious circumstances over the past 2 years, creating an immediate link between all the deaths that had plagued Louisiana's planter community. The investigation that followed finally connected the murders to Matthieu. His escape, combined with his pharmaceutical knowledge and his presence at the Devereaux plantation during the dinner party, made him the obvious suspect. Authorities questioned Josephine extensively, but she maintained complete ignorance of any poisoning activities, claiming that Matthieu had been a gentle, quiet man who never showed signs of violence or discussed revenge. Without Matthieu present to confirm or deny the accusations, and without Josephine providing any useful testimony, authorities could document what had happened, but couldn't bring anyone to trial. The case remained technically open, but everyone understood that Matthieu Devereaux had successfully committed at least 22 murders and escaped justice completely. Samuel Pritchard, the newspaper editor who had first written about the plague of deaths, published a comprehensive article about the case in December of 1849. His account detailed the discovery of the poison vials, the investigation that linked Matthieu to the murders, and the sophisticated methods used to make each death appear natural or accidental. The article was picked up by newspapers throughout the South and even in northern states, where it contributed to growing debates about slavery and the capabilities of enslaved people. The reaction to Pritchard's article revealed the deep divisions in American society regarding slavery. Southern newspapers focused on the danger posed by educated slaves and called for stricter laws prohibiting literacy and restricting access to medical knowledge. Several states passed legislation explicitly forbidding slaves from being trained in chemistry, pharmacy, or advanced medicine, citing the Devereaux case as justification. But northern abolitionist newspapers interpreted the story differently. They saw Matthieu as a hero who had used his intelligence to fight back against an evil system, and they held up his campaign as evidence that enslaved people possessed the same human capacity for complex thought and planning that white people claimed was impossible. Frederick Douglass, the former slave who had become a prominent abolitionist speaker, referenced the Devereaux case in several speeches, arguing that Matthieu's actions demonstrated the fundamental humanity and intelligence of black people. If a man can plan and execute such a sophisticated campaign of resistance, Douglass said in an 1850 speech in Boston, then how can anyone claim that he is naturally inferior or suited for bondage? Matthieu Devereaux used the very education that slave owners provided to destroy them. That should tell you everything you need to know about the true nature of slavery. Josephine survived for another 6 years after Matthieu's escape, dying in 1855 from complications of chronic illness. She never revealed whether she had known about Matthieu's poisoning campaign, and she never saw him again after his escape. In her final weeks, she told other slaves that she had no regrets about her life, except that she wished she could have left with her husband when he fled. He did what needed doing, she said shortly before her death. Those men deserved what they got, and Matthieu deserved to be free. I hope he's somewhere warm and safe, living the life we should have had together. Matthieu Devereaux was never caught. Periodic rumors surfaced over the years, claiming that he had been seen in Mexico, California, or even Canada, but none were ever confirmed. He simply vanished into history, leaving behind only the glass vials buried beneath a cypress tree, and a story that would be whispered about for generations. The 12 plantation owners who died in his campaign were eventually reburied in the circular arrangement beneath the cypress tree, creating a permanent monument to Louisiana's darkest period. The cemetery groundskeepers reported strange occurrences around that spot, sounds of men screaming at night, the smell of poison in the air, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Whether these reports were genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the power of suggestion is impossible to say. But the stories persisted long enough that locals refused to enter the cemetery after dark. In 1923, a historian researching Louisiana's antebellum period located what appeared to be Matthieu's journal in an archive in Mexico City. The document had been donated to the archive in 1891 by an elderly man who claimed to have received it from a black American doctor living in Veracruz. The journal's contents matched all the known details of the Devereaux case, and the chemical formulas it contained were accurate according to modern scientific analysis. But without being able to verify the document's authenticity or locate the man who had supposedly written it, historians could not definitively prove that the journal was genuine. The journal, if authentic, revealed details about Matthieu's life after his escape that had never been publicly known. According to the document, he had indeed reached Mexico and settled in a small town where he resumed his work as a healer, using his medical knowledge to help local residents while living under an assumed name. He never married again, though he formed close friendships with other formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Mexico. He continued documenting his life and thoughts in his journal until 1889, when the entries abruptly stopped, presumably because of his death. The journal's final entry, dated March 14, 1889, exactly 43 years after the day his life with Josephine was destroyed, contained a reflection on his actions and their meaning. I am an old man now, and I know I will soon join Josephine wherever souls go after death. When I stand before whatever judgment awaits, I will not apologize for the 22 men I killed. They participated in a system that treated human beings as property, that raped women with impunity, that destroyed families for profit. My only regret is that I could not kill more of them before I had to flee. People will debate whether what I did was justice or murder. To me, there is no debate. When a system denies justice to an entire race of people, when it makes legal the most horrific crimes as long as the victims are black, then individuals must create their own justice through whatever means available. I used my education, my intelligence, and my knowledge of chemistry to fight back against monsters. If that makes me a monster too, then so be it. Better to be a monster who fought than a victim who suffered in silence. In 1967, when Hurricane Audrey uprooted the ancient cypress tree in the St. Landry Cemetery, the construction workers discovered the lead box containing the 12 glass vials exactly where Matthieu had buried them 118 years earlier. The vials were still sealed, the poison inside still potent enough that the coroner ordered them destroyed immediately to prevent any accidents. But before the vials were destroyed, they were photographed and documented, creating a permanent record of Matthieu Devereaux's campaign of revenge. The photographs show 12 identical glass vials, each carefully labeled with a name and a single word in elegant French script: vengeance. Those images remain in Louisiana's state archives, a testament to one man's refusal to accept injustice and his willingness to use every resource at his disposal to fight back against overwhelming oppression. So what do you think about Matthieu Devereaux's story? Was he a hero who fought against an evil system? Or a murderer who killed innocent people? The answer probably depends on whether you think anyone who participated in slavery could truly be called innocent. But one thing is undeniable. Matthieu Devereaux successfully challenged one of the fundamental assumptions of slave society, that enslaved people were incapable of complex planning and sophisticated resistance. His campaign of poison killed at least 22 plantation owners without ever being caught, proving that education and intelligence could be more powerful weapons than physical force. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Louisiana's darkest mysteries, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and historical mysteries. And drop a comment telling me what other buried stories from America's past you want to hear about. The history books don't tell you everything, but we're here to uncover the stories they tried to forget. Until next time, remember that the past is never as simple as we've been taught, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones that were deliberately hidden from view.